All right, thanks for coming. My name is Rich Buchholz. I'm a professor in the Department of Biology and the newly created Center for Biodiversity and Conservation Research at the University of Mississippi. And I've been tasked with trying to define conservation behavior for you. What I'm going to present is my view. There are other books and papers for different frameworks for conservation behavior, and we're going to be putting together a bibliography for this and some of the other talks, so that will be available online as well. And so you're welcome to look at those. There we go. So you're all animal behaviorists, so you know that as animal behaviorists, we're interested in survival and reproduction and the sort of hows and whys behind those end results for animals. We may look at why animals choose the diets that they do, why they choose the mates that they do, why some species protect their young while other species just allow their young to grow on their own without any care, how individuals are able to compete with other individuals to gain resources. This history of animal behavior study has created a set of skills, but also frameworks that are really translatable to the behavioral issues in conservation. So just very generally, I would say that conservation behavior is taking advantage of the existing theoretical frameworks in animal behavior and the various skills that we bring to play. And this is not just those who call themselves animal behaviorists, but also comparative psychologists and neuroethologists and behavioral ecologists. All those people who are interested in variation within individuals and their behavior, variation between individuals and their behavior, and differences between species. All of those people who study those things have skills that can help conservation. We haven't talked about this much in the sort of history of conservation behavior, but conservation behavior subscribes to the same tenets as conservation biology as a whole. And that is that we believe that biodiversity is good, that wild species have an intrinsic value and a right to exist, and therefore extinction is bad. We know there's a biodiversity crisis. By some estimates, 20%, at least, of vertebrate species are threatened with extinction. And our concerns are that even more populations are declining. And so conservation behavior, like conservation biology, is a crisis discipline. We have to act quickly, and we have to manage our resources in this process. This doesn't mean that conservation behavior has all the answers for conservation issues. The problems are complex, and behavior applies to some subset of that problem. So where does conservation behavior fit in? Steve Beisinger wrote about this issue. And what he said is it fits in three areas. One, behavior can be really helpful in preventing further biodiversity loss. And so its value then comes into understanding and predicting how species will use protected areas that we set aside for them. So for instance, if you're carving out a reserve area for a particular species, you need to know the sizes of their home ranges and how they use those home ranges and see how that overlaps with the reserve area, and how many individuals can fit into that reserve to form a viable population. Another way that behavior will be important is in figuring out the compromise between development for human purposes and preservation of nature. And so this includes sustainable development. It includes sort of managing reserves in a context of human disturbance. As an example, if we put in a highway that divides a forested area, these koalas run the risk of getting hit by cars on the highway. Well, we can create an underpass, but how do you get koalas to use it? So behaviorists can help in understanding what is necessary for these animals to actually disperse underneath the highway through these underpasses. In this case, they cleverly just put in horizontal logs, and the koalas were much more willing to pass under the underpass when that was done. And then finally, an area that probably has received the most attention, and that is trying to recover already threatened and endangered species. So you might think about this in terms of captive breeding, For instance, these are black-footed ferrets that were born in captivity as a result of artificial insemination, which of course is labor-intensive. And so the behaviorists could look at the reproductive behavior and decide, why are these individuals not mating naturally? What are the issues involved in natural breeding in captivity? But also for small wild populations, when animals are down to very low numbers, often the things that were adaptive for them to do in the past may not work at those small population sizes. And so we need to bring in behaviorists to understand how animals are behaving and whether that behavior remains adaptive and how it might be managed so that those small wild populations can grow again. So those are some of the places that behavior fits into the needs of conservation. Now, animal behaviorists typically, historically, use a framework to approach behavioral questions or problems. And I think that framework can apply to conservation problems as well. So Nico Tinbergen, one of the so-called fathers of ethology, said we can ask 4 questions or take 4 approaches to any one behavior. So mechanisms involve looking at the underlying neural processes or endocrine processes that allow a behavior to happen. And ontogeny, or development, looks at the change of behavior over time. Where did the animal start doing that behavior? Did it involve learning? And then we have adaptive function. Exactly in that population, how does that behavior encourage survival and reproduction? And then finally, phylogeny, or evolutionary history. What are the patterns across species that are a result of their selective pressures in the past that result in species differences today? So that theoretical framework is widely used in animal behavior studies. How would we apply this to a conservation problem? Well, let's just pick one example. Let's look at fisheries bycatch. So in commercial fisheries, much more gets caught that's thrown away dead than the target species that the fishermen are trying to catch that have commercial value. And so these are all sorts of small fishes and invertebrates, but also some very big things like porpoises and sea turtles and sharks that often have very low reproductive potential. And this puts a serious dent in their populations if they're being killed during these fisheries. And so how could we approach this problem using Tinbergen's 4 approaches? Well, let's take the example of dolphins getting caught in gill nets put out by fishermen. We could first look at the mechanisms behind this and try to understand, well, dolphins are smart. How are they ending up in the net? Could it be that they actually don't perceive the net very well, either visually or with their sonar? Is there a way we could change the characteristics of a net to make it sensorily more available to the dolphins so that they don't blunder into the net? And we could look at the learning by dolphins and ask, why are they associating with these fishing boats? Why are they going close to nets? And perhaps ask, do they learn this from other dolphins? And is there a point in their life cycle where we could try to experimentally introduce something to make it clear that this is something that they shouldn't learn as a positive? We could also ask, why are they going to these nets? Dolphins should be able to catch fish on their own. Are they able to eat different fish that are caught in those nets? Is that why they're going to them? Or perhaps the fisheries in the area have been depleted and they're actually starving, and that's why they're going to the nets. We need those sorts of levels of information. And then finally, evolutionary history is not just for dolphins, but for all marine mammals. What predisposes them to being found in bycatch? Is there something about their mating systems, or about their migration patterns, or about their dietary preferences that makes some species more likely to be susceptible to capture and death by bycatch than other species? Now, this is just sort of a random set of things that came to my mind, but in any behavioral problem in the context of conservation, it really behooves us to think broadly and think about all the different ways we could investigate the question so that we fully understand the issue and fully understand possible solutions. Now, ultimately, this alone, the answers to these questions, will be inadequate for conservation, right, to achieve population stabilization and ideally population growth. We have to translate these sort of findings into demographic and spatial consequences that are valuable to managing species. And so Steve Beisinger said, to succeed, conservation behavior must be directly translated either into demographic and or spatial consequences, because that's the currency of conservation efforts, right? Growing populations. So we can't do this alone. As behaviorists, we're a small set of the other types of biologists involved in conservation. And as conservation biologists, we're a subset of all the types of scientists that are involved in conservation. And I think that as someone approaches or becomes interested in conservation behavior, you have to go in understanding that you don't have all the answers, but being sure that you do have good answers for part of this picture. And for me, at least, one of the greatest challenges has been finding and interacting with these other people who are interested in conservation but may not understand behavior very well and understand its contribution to saving populations. Another challenge, I think, for the conservation behaviorist is the fact that habitat and seeing environmental destruction really, in many cases, makes us want to turn away from the problem. And I think you have to be inspired to know that conservation has made a difference in the past. And when you see something like this, yes, it's depressing, but it's also an opportunity for you to play a role in making a difference. There are lots of studies out there looking at conservation. There's one in particular of birds that has shown that efforts at conservation have resulted in 67% lower extinction rate of birds than you would have expected had conservation science not been involved. And some species did go extinct, but think about that. We saved a lot of species just by trying and engaging in conservation science. And I think the contribution of conservation behavior provides a new perspective that conservation biologists have not really involved very strongly up to now. And I think we can add new ideas that will help us save even more species. And so as you apply your tool set of the animal behaviors to conservation problems, I want you to be confident that you can make a difference and you can play an important role in saving species. And you need to be inspired and work as part of a team of other behaviorists, other biologists, but all other kinds of scientists, including social scientists. Thank you.